packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer J.J. Manella, here with Drew Conry Murray, and we have a fantastic guest today. Omar Santos is joining us. He's a distinguished engineer of cybersecurity and AI research with Cisco Systems. And Omar also ran PSIRT at Cisco for 16 years. So Drew and I are digging into all sorts of topics from AI and how Cisco is using data and collecting data to what it means to run security and PSIRT across a portfolio as broad as Cisco's. Drew, what was your favorite part here?
There's so many. I mean, we do have some interesting AI discussions, but we also talk about what the process is like inside Cisco to get a CVE out the door. It's a lot more complicated than maybe you think. And we also talk about sort of like what the industry is doing around vulnerabilities. There's a new initiative out called VEX that we dig into that's trying to help keep organizations more updated on the status of vulnerability. So we dig into a lot of great stuff. Omar is a great guest, so stick around. This is a good one.
And last note on this, one of the things is I did recently do a presentation at an event where we talked about how to find different vulnerabilities in products. And it sounds like Cisco actually has a Cisco vulnerability repository that's an interactive portal you can use with, human interaction or maybe APIs. So we've got tons of links for you guys in the show notes. So check those out. So Omar, I've known and watched you for years, and during a lot of that time, you were managing PSIRT and other security operations. But now, for the past couple of years, your title is Distinguished Engineer with Cybersecurity and AI Research. So what does that mean, and what are you doing every day?
Yeah, and by the way, I don't like the distinguished engineer. I don't know who came up with that term, but it's a senior leader. So I serve both as a technical advisor or a strategic advisor, if I would say that. And even believe it or not, yes, I still get my hands dirty. So a hands-on engineer whenever it comes to actually, looking at how to advance these technologies and efforts across Cisco. So Cisco has a team called Security and Trust Organization. That's where I belong. And as a matter of fact, that team is about 1,100 people or so, give or take.
Wow.
All the incident response teams, including CSIRT, PSIRT, our offensive security teams, product security office, insider threat, the people that drive the security development lifecycle, market access, compliance, you name it, we all, reside within that team. And my day-to-day job basically is deep diving into emerging threats and leveraging nowadays artificial intelligence also to accelerate this. So if I summarize it in one sentence, is securing our AI implementations, what I do now, and also using AI for security, right? So I work with pretty much everybody at Cisco, right? From software developers, services organizations, sales, and then of course, my cybersecurity engineers. Beyond the technical work, I help. Right. That's what I'm supposed to do, right? Help shape security and trust strategy and making sure that we're all prepared for this evolving landscape that is changing by the second nowadays. It used to be by the minute, now it's by the second. Like that's what I say. And then I also dedicate a lot to mentor teams within Cisco and outside of Cisco. This also includes contributing to industry groups and standards bodies. I lead the Coalition for Secure AI with Anthropic, Google, OpenAI, NVIDIA, a whole bunch of different companies in there. I also chair a couple of standards. One is the Common Security Advisory Framework, or CSAF, which is now an ISO standard, OpenEOX, and a few other things. One of the things that I'm super passionate about is giving back to the community. So I'm one of the original leads of the DEF CON Red Team Village here in Raleigh. I helped create the B-sides. So overall, if you think about it, my role is to blend technical and strategic leadership and of course, mentoring and contributing to the community.
Nice. The important stuff. It sounded like when you listed off the security and trust group within Cisco, there was a long list of there, and I was trying to kind of wrap my head around, is all of that related to products and services Cisco delivers, or is it also parts of Cisco's internal security GRC strategy?
No, this is only internal. The products is way bigger.
Okay.
I'm not from a product team. By the way, whenever you say I led the PSIRT team, from a technical perspective, I led the PSIRT team. So I report to the CSO of Cisco, the CISO. Actually, we have different CISOs at Cisco, but the main CISO reports to him. But that 1,100 people plus, and we're hiring, by the way, but is offensive security for finding vulnerabilities internally at Cisco and in products, cloud security, but this one is both for the enterprise applications and also for how to secure the infrastructure of these cloud services that we have. But each of the teams, they also have a security team, each of the products. The other element, of course, all the CSIRT, PSIRT, data protection, market access. We call it market access, but it's basically government regulations, compliance, etc. Insider threat, We have teams that are specialized on creating, we call foundational securities. Like, for example, one of the things that we do at Cisco is we standardize all the TLS implementations. So we have a team that is dedicated on how to actually do that. And then they give that as a service to other areas across Cisco. So it's a big organization. It's a pretty big investment.
Yes, and Cisco itself has a huge security portfolio, firewall, SASE, email security, SIEM, so on. So can you give us some idea of how the company manages like security and vulnerabilities across that portfolio?
Yeah, absolutely. So within that security and trust, we have specialized teams with product development expertise. So we actually typically hire or steal people from the software developers and other operations as well, even customer support, like, the TAC. At the end of the day, it's actually to be able to integrate security at pretty much every level, from the design phase to the end of the product, right? It is easier said than done. As you see, we grow significantly through acquisitions as well, right?
Yeah.
So each of those acquisitions can be small as a team of 10 or a big company like Splunk, right?
Right.
They actually also have a pretty robust and mature life cycle of a product. So one of the things that we do whenever we acquire companies is to make sure that we have a level of integration, not only from a product level, but from a security standpoint. We basically compare notes from the beginning, whenever after the due diligence, et cetera, whenever we can because of regulations. That's the first thing that we do. We embed people in their teams. I'm talking about a significant company, the size of Splunk. The other ones, is pretty easy, right? These are pretty easy acquisitions. But again, if you think about it, this is a significant investment. Again, we have 1,100 people, at least as of today. Probably we're going to grow a little bit, but a big portion of the team is dedicated to our product security lifecycle.
Omar, I have to poke into this a little bit because I think a lot of professionals listening to this are probably putting Cisco in the same big bucket with like HPE and some of the other large vendors. And the word on the street is you guys all do a horrible job of integrating products after you have an acquisition. So I'm just curious, you being on the inside of that, what are some of the things that we don't see on the outside?
Yeah.
That's meaningful to that process?
Absolutely. So one of the things, at least I can talk about our security function, right? Product integration strategy, et cetera. It all depends on the product. Again, Cisco does a lot more than just security, whether it's the Splunks of the world that I mentioned, or collaboration, et cetera, right? So depending on that type of integration, it may be that you leave that company as a subsidiary working for a little while, right? We learned our lessons in the past, from many integration efforts, that in some cases you actually have to do this methodical.
It seems like with, Meraki, say, Cisco sort of just let that run almost as an independent business unit for a fairly long time.
That's actually the perfect example there. Meraki, even though they operated, in isolation for a little while, we were also integrating some of the technology behind the scenes, whether it's the access points, et cetera. They operated for quite some time as a separate entity, I would say, right? Now, the cool thing is, and that's some of the lessons learned in there, the cool thing is that now all the developer organizations report to the same person, to Jitu Patel.
Oh.
So now, hopefully, we drive to not have that type of isolation in the.
Since you brought up Meraki specifically, Drew, I have heard, and I think this is not here, so I believe this is like publicly shared for the past year or so, that they're actually now streamlining it back into one portfolio family and that the whole Meraki brand is going to go away.
Yeah, we'll not call it the Meraki brand will go away. That's above my pay grade.
I believe that was a statement I saw in a Cisco blog post on a Cisco website, but maybe I'm misremembering that.
There's definitely a one platform strategy here.
Yeah.
For sure.
And so how does that work with the security then, with the product side?
Yeah, so from a product security perspective, we were integrated with that team. So each of the major organizations at Cisco, the major product development teams, they also have their own security teams that kind of dotted report to our CSO. So in that case, it was not like their security was actually done in isolation. The product is a different thing, right? But imagine if you have a company, again, I'm not going to talk about Meraki only here, but if you have a small company or a big company that already had some services for security, but now you can take advantage of that 1,100 people and a big machine that, whether it's through budget, people, tools, etc., that we try to integrate from day one, because it doesn't make sense to actually run things in isolation, even from a business standpoint.
So if you're bringing in like Splunk, they probably have their own culture, their own set of technologies, their own processes. What is it like trying to align that with the way Cisco does security internally or security development?
Yeah, one of the things that we definitely do, again, even if we have done the security and trust and PSIRT and everything for a long time. As a matter of fact, PSIRT was actually created in 1995, way before I get to Cisco. Been at Cisco for 25 years now. It was a smaller company.
Well, so that wait. That wasn't way before you got to Cisco.
I got to Cisco in 1999, right after the Marine Corps. Like I was fresh out of the Marine Corps. Basically, one of the things that now we realize that, if you have companies like Splunk, one of the leaders in security, and platforms, out there, there's a lot of probably lessons learned that they also have. So be open that is not your policies, your processes, methods that you use, is that, can we learn from it? And by the way, the answer is yes, in many cases. And depending on the product family, even for non-security products, we actually have learned a lot of really cool techniques that those companies actually had, right? Whether it's collaboration, like BroadSoft and many others. There's two things that I always mention that humbles you in life. One is cybersecurity and AI, and how they're put together, definitely humbles you. You have to come with that mentality. It's not a more of some central team, just, dictating of what you actually have to do or not.
So before we get into the AI, I want to uncover a couple more of these little PSIRT things because I'm just dying to kind of understand some of the processes, because I have watched various speakers, peers of yours from other organizations talk about kind of what that bug bounty process looks like, responsible disclosures, figuring out patching. So in a company the size of Cisco, how does that work? Like, is it segmented and you've got product managers dealing with that, or does PSIRT, how does it work?
Yeah, basically, if it is vulnerability reports against Cisco products or a service, like let's say Umbrella, WebEx, etc., all that gets routed through PSIRT. Now, PSIRT, in that case, we work with the source of the report. And what is the source? You mentioned, a few. Bug bounties, we have private and public bug bounties. As a matter of fact, we were talking about Meraki, they have a public bug bounty. Splunk, it has their own, et cetera, et cetera. As a matter of fact, I either am cursed or blessed to be the one that created the policy at Cisco for bug bounties. So again, we have a lot of things actually running kind of behind the scenes in that. However, the majority of the vulnerabilities actually do not come even that way. The publicly reported vulnerabilities, many of them are attack, a technical assistance center support case that somebody's troubleshooting.
Okay.
Don't know what is a security vulnerability, and whenever the attack investigates, this may have some impact to security, and then they escalate to us.
So are attack trained? Do you guys train and interact with them so that they can identify that and help you?
Yes. Not only we train them, we have other tools, like we look for specific keywords and elements, through the case that will definitely suggest to the engineer, hey, this may be related to either a bug that we know or vulnerability that we know, and so on. And then the other thing is that we have tools, like, for example, if somebody is investigating a crash, some device crash, we have, tools that the attack actually uses for crash dumps, and then that in there, can tell, hey, there's maybe a security problem in here. So that's one thing. Of course, the independent security researchers, that's a given. We have a few from those. But remember that internal team that I mentioned, offensive security, we call it ASIC, the Advanced Security Initiatives Group. It's a team about a little bit over 100 people that are dedicated to actually find those vulnerabilities. Now, the challenge with that is that every single security research, pen testing, red teaming, whatever you want to call it, is point in time.
Right.
So what we have is either we invest into a lot of tools. In some cases, we acquire the companies, but in some other cases, we invest in other tools to actually find these a little bit more programmatically, if you will. The other thing is each of the product teams have their own security advocates and their own security tools and so on. So the majority of the vulnerabilities, as a matter of fact, if you look at the PSIRT list, we disclose everything. We disclose internally found, publicly found, etc. Most of the vendors actually don't do that. When we take a black eye, as a matter of fact, I posted through FIRST several years ago that the counting of the CVEs is not a way to look at security maturity. Because if I don't disclose the internally found vulnerabilities, then it will be a really, really, really nice, beautiful, page with only a few vulnerabilities in there. The other element is not about your vulnerabilities anymore. It's about understanding that everybody's actually using open source. There's thousands upon thousands of vulnerabilities that affect every single product. Nothing is immune to vulnerabilities. Cisco products, X, Y, and Z, etc. And what we also try to do is create some of the standards that are needed in order for you to disclose that, not in a human readable document, because humans are not going to be able to keep up with, but in machine readable information. Like I mentioned, that ISO standard, the Common Security Advisory Framework, that's the basis for something that in the industry we call VEX, the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. change, right?
I was just about to ask you about that. Yeah, I know you've done some work there.
And that is mostly driven through APIs. Like we have an API called Open Vuln API, and that's how we disclose vulnerabilities and so on. But anyways, going back to kind of behind the scenes, how we work with a resource. Whenever we do the initial investigation or do the triage, and also, by the way, my team has helped create the EPSS of the world, the CVSS, etc. As a matter of fact, Nick from PSIRT, he's the co-chair over there now. We use those standard, right, to triage, but none of them are perfect. You actually have to really understand the technical implications of a vulnerability and then go beyond just a CVSS score.
And a CVSS score is what gives us the criticality of a vulnerability.
Yeah, CVSS score is a starting point. Then we look also at EPSS. So time to predict is this vulnerability may be exploited the next 30 days or so, and especially for third-party software vulnerabilities and so on. But let's assume that it's a Cisco first-party vulnerability, right? Whenever we get the report from either a security researcher, from the attack, from a bug bounty, etc., and the initial investigation is complete, then definitely we're working with engineering to actually get the fix, and then we'll disclose the vulnerability. However, if the vulnerability, we know that there's some type of public knowledge or exploitation, then we disclose right away, even without a fix. And that's one of the things that we take a pretty big stand, and a lot of people kind of hate us from that. Oh, you're disclosing this without a fix. Well, it's been exploited. I need to know, and at least give you some type of risk awareness, even if it's no workaround.
Yeah. I mean, there are some organizations that it makes unplugging something as an answer, right? Like they may make that decision and that's totally cool, but it's not fair as a defender to not have the same information the offensive teams and the malicious actors might have.
Absolutely, 100%. And as a matter of fact, in many cases, I'll give you a perfect scenario. Talos just published a little bit of this a couple of weeks ago. In some cases, actually most of those cases, we even go to CISA and say, hey, put this vulnerability in the KEF catalog. Because to be honest, even though we make beautiful advisories, and so on, nobody reads them, that they need to take action, right? So if you put them in other places, like in the KEF catalog, or, even facilitate that a scanner is picking up this vulnerability. And yes, we complain about false positive and everything, but guess what? The number one and number two users in that Open Vuln API are the scanners of the world and all security vendors. I'd rather actually for them to have some type of actionable information like that. That's, oh man, they're competitors, they're going to get advantage of it and so on. But going back to the process, yes, that's one of the things we do. If we have some information about public exploitation, public knowledge and everything, we just publish to everybody at the same time. We also, I want to capitalize on that or highlight that. We publish all vulnerabilities to everybody at the same time. So it's not like, hey, we have certain customers and so on. No, of course, if the customer that reported the vulnerability knows about it, that's because they're reporting it. That's a given. But if, let's say, if I know of a vulnerability in a core router of the internet, even though if you don't have a core router on the internet, I'm still disclosing everything publicly.
Yeah.
So you're not saying there's like a platinum level access to get vulnerability information earlier?
And believe me, some companies even try to even offer money. Hey, we pay you. Like, no.
I would imagine various federal governments from various parts of the world might sign up for that. So then I have a question, and this is, a hypothetical question, and this is absolutely not specific to Cisco. I'm just asking you this as a professional here who's worked in this space. Then if there's a vendor out there, let's call it, Acme, whatever, and there's just public buzz about a vulnerability that's being actively exploited, but the vendor hasn't officially disclosed or acknowledged that, like no blog post, no CVE, no nothing. What might that indicate? What could be going on there?
Yeah, and this, again, regardless of the vendors, I can only speak for Cisco and throw rocks to Cisco because I love that. That's my team, right? So that's what I do. But I'm pretty sure that this actually works the same in pretty much all major vendors out there. If a vulnerability only affects a product at Cisco and there's public knowledge of the vulnerability, and whenever I say public knowledge, credible public knowledge, not some random dude in Reddit, the account was created yesterday and they just want to troll. But if it's significant, credible information that the vulnerability is public or has been exploited, and we know for a fact that it is, we will disclose. Believe me, that's a lot easier than not doing that. To be honest, a lot of people think, oh my God, they just hoard vulnerabilities and then they disclose it at a given time. It's a lot easier for me to actually get a vulnerability, investigate it, disclose it, get the product team to fix it, than running around multiple months and wasting money and efforts. Then we move to the next, right?
So if a vendor doesn't disclose, though, is there something else going on?
So for the disclosure, for sure. The things that are more complicated, if the vulnerability affects other vendor, let's say my vulnerability also affects Microsoft and Juniper and X, Y, and Z. We work with people like CERT to coordinate the disclosure. So it's not up to Cisco to disclose it. And that's one of the things that most people don't realize. Sometimes there are these buzz of vulnerabilities that people think that Cisco or whatever the vendor is, want to keep them internally. And that's not the case. Now, if it is a vulnerability that there's no public knowledge and we're working with engineering, it was found internally or we found through a customer, a lot of customers, especially big service providers, have asked us for many years to bundle those. So think about like the Microsoft Tuesdays, that they do every Tuesdays. We have our own of iOS XE, and ASA FTD. We kind of try to bundle that. So if I didn't do that, then every Wednesday of every month, because typically we publish on Wednesdays, if we can control the vulnerability, then it will be every single Wednesday, right? I mean, it would be pretty impactful.
Yeah, that would suck.
And as a matter of fact, we actually have had some more mature customers asking us, why did you even publish this? It's like, it doesn't even affect me. It's like, yeah, but it will affect somebody around the world. Right? So that's the balance. But yeah, behind the scenes, there's a lot of things that can go. One is that we're working with other vendors that are impacted by the vulnerabilities. In some cases, we're working with vendors that are impacted, that even though they do not disclose the vulnerability, they want to have at least a little bit more time for getting their support teams, et cetera, right? So all that is coordinated through CERT.
Okay. Are there times where there might be law enforcement involved that directs a vendor to withhold something while they're investigating?
No, so for law enforcement, that's more of a disclosure of the attack.
Okay.
Not the actual, hey, you have an SNMP vulnerability, right? That, as a matter of fact, pretty much everything that I get engaged in those type of scenarios are either super old, end of life, end of support. I'll give you the perfect real life scenario. I was working with many governments on Jaguar Tooth. Jaguar Tooth was 2 years ago. The UK government actually was the one that first published it, and it was against critical infrastructure, both in Europe and the UK and the US. And Jaguar Tooth, if you look at the malware report, and whenever they gave me the first version that was affected, it was an 18-year-old version of code in a platform that whenever I came to Cisco, again, 25 years ago, they were already planning to actually, decommission. And this still runs in very, 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 very critical places. The other thing is most of the vulnerabilities in that scenario, like I'll get the Sol Typhoon out of the way, right? So if you look at this type of newer in the media attack campaigns, some of those are actually leveraging vulnerabilities that were in 2017, 2018, and so on. Right. So whenever you work with kind of law enforcement, the vulnerability is already disclosed.
Yeah.
Is that now we're working to say that it's exploited, right? And how is it exploited? Now the TTPs and all that stuff, yeah, that's something that we coordinate properly.
Okay. So there's a little bit of difference between the actual CVE, which is just enumerating the vulnerability itself, and then how they got there, and the TTPs. Okay.
That's exactly right.
So is there sort of a generally accepted timeline or window from a bug being reported to becoming a CVE? Is there sort of like a target time that you want to have, or what's the typical time?
In my opinion, yesterday is the appropriate time. And believe me, this is something, again, I'm taking my Cisco hat off. I'm not representing Cisco in my opinions in here and so on. This is what I'm passionate about outside of Cisco driving some of these standards, is that people think that, oh my God, you're going to hold a vulnerability for 3 months and so on. But the reality of it is that there are many, many vulnerabilities that are open source that attackers will take advantage and are taking advantage of. That how are you going to scale to that? Imagine, yes, for first-party vulnerabilities, you have a plethora of CVEs that come, from the Cisco's, the Microsoft, the NVIDIAs, the big companies like that. But now the open source is in the thousands upon thousands. Just last year, over 14,000 open source vulnerabilities. And if you have 1,200 products, one of those products will be affected by that vulnerability. So imagine me now publishing 12,000 times, 14,000. It will be an advisory per hour, probably, right? I mean, I cannot quantify. As a matter of fact, a good friend of mine, he's actually doing that type of a calculation in a conference here locally in Raleigh called VulnCon, which it was significant. It was like an hour or an hour and a half per vulnerability. If I was going to publish that as a security advisory at Cisco, for those scenarios, we kind of created the opposite. It's a tool called CVR, the Cisco Vulnerability Repository, and then we exposed the VEX. So VEX, again, Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. And what that is tell me the status of a given vulnerability by giving you a CVE. if it is I don't know, Log4j or etc. Again, we all learn from those events that you need to scale at a bigger, it's going to be machines, not humans reading an advisory that this vulnerability will be impacted. And see how I set the status. In many cases, those vulnerabilities, even if you're impacted, or if the software that you're using is the same version, they may not be impacted in the same way. I have two different products with the same vulnerability and open source. One product may be impacted in a completely different way than the next one, because it all depends on the library, how you use it, etc. So if you provide that type of actionable information and say, hey, this vulnerability is unknown, we don't know, it's under investigation, and then at 4:00 changes to we're impacted, and then 3 days later we have, hopefully 3 days later or a day later and so on, we have a fix, then all that type of status checks, it's not going to be a human picking up the phone, hey, calling the tag. It's going to be some type of API to actually be able to determine this.
So there is then, it sounds like, is this VEX like an industry effort to do this kind of coordination among large vendors and other entities?
Yes, indeed. As a matter of fact, this is something that I personally work with folks from CISA like Alan Friedman, Justin, as a matter of fact, the co-chair of that standard now for the Common Security Advisory Framework. He is a person from CISA, and one of the major contributors is BSI from Germany. So what we're trying to do is standardize the way that a vendor not only should disclose the third-party software vulnerability or the status of that vulnerability, but how we're going to discover it. Like each vendor has their own page, etc. And then the way that we're trying to do this is with .well-known, I can't go into the technical details, but .well-known provider metadata that is in JSON that is discoverable. So if I go to Google, if I go to Cisco, if I go, it's predictable. There's another standard called security.text that allows you to discover that. So it's not about just publishing the vulnerability or having an API to it, but it's how can I discover this information? There are other standards like Raleigh, which also allows you to list, the vulnerability information and so on. I'm not going to go into all the technical details in there, but yeah, it's definitely not a Cisco-only element. It came really popular whenever we were all talking about software bill of materials, right? And SBOMs for supply chain and so on.
Okay, so you've mentioned VEX several times, and we've heard SBOM, which is kind of the 4-letter dirty word right now in security and supply chain. Do you see the industry moving from SBOM to VEX? Is VEX like the next iteration of SBOM, just a new, better hotness, or is it something different? Like, how does this fit into our strategy?
No, yeah, absolutely. And that's actually a perfect question. SBOMs are not going to be replaced by VEX. That's the number one thing. They're actually complementary to each other. And to go into a little bit more detail, the purpose of SBOMs is for an entity, whether it's a software provider, hardware provider, and so on, to list the bill of materials, what it makes up their software. And in the case of an HBOM is the hardware bill of material. So the main reason that SBOMs assist is for transparency of what are the open source and also commercial entities that actually make up that software. One of the original purposes of it was to say, okay, well, then if I have that list, can I determine what are the vulnerabilities that affect that product? The term VEX was created part of that SBOM efforts. As a matter of fact, VEX was a term that CISA actually created, for that type of exchange of vulnerabilities. That's what it stands for, Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. And it was because we know that we're not going to be able to scale, just like I mentioned earlier, but we have to also accelerate the way that a security advisory can now have a real-time status of that type of a vulnerability. Now, the actual underlying efforts of VEX was originally introduced as part of a profile in the Common Security Advisory Framework, which is actually the standard. That was even before the whole SBOM. CSAF now is the second version, but started, back in 2006 with another name called the Common Vulnerability Reporting Framework. And it was part of ICASI, got transitioned to FIRST. I brought it to OASIS. Long story short, it is a standard for publishing security advisory information. There's a profile called their VEX that you can have an SBOM or not. You can associate that report of vulnerabilities to an SBOM to say, hey, if now you have these software bill of materials for these products, these are all the vulnerabilities that we know that may affect or not affect elements of the software bill of materials. Now, within all the standards of SBOMs, and I cannot believe that I'm saying all the standards, it should be only one, but anyways, whether it's Cyclone DX or SPDX, they also can make a reference to that VEX document. As a matter of fact, they do support the listing of vulnerabilities. They call it VEX, but unfortunately that's point in time, right? So if I put whether it's a binary decomposition tool or source code interrogation tool and it creates me an SBOM, then that's from the moment that I'm actually publishing that product, I'm creating that product or publishing that image and so on. But there's more vulnerabilities that are going to be introduced. So what the VEX profile in something like CSAF is that, yes, you already published the SBOM, but now there's two more vulnerabilities that not only are introduced, but either under investigation, it's not exploited, it's not affected, and so on. You can give that type of status in a more scalable format.
Okay. So is VEX something that like an end company would consume, or more that vendors and researchers and so on are using?
Yeah, we have a lot of customers that actually are now consuming VEX. Now, that's one thing that, again, I'm not representing Cisco. This is just kind of behind the scenes, in my opinion. There are a lot of companies, whether you're a financial services customer or manufacturing plant and so on, that have always asked, hey, what is the status of your Log4j vulnerability? And we basically publish an advisory, and then we update that advisory 3 times a day. And then there's a technical writer that it pushes, that advisory to the page. Definitely that's not the way to scale. So what they now are asking, hey, I now have tools that can consume this through APIs, right? For SBOMs, we have gotten a lot of requests. And to be honest, I don't think that not that many people are actually using them how they are supposed to be, right? In most cases, it's kind of like a checkbox.
Yeah.
I ask for an SBOM, you get the SBOM.
Yeah.
And I know that it's been recorded, but we had a bug in a tool that we had an SBOM. It didn't even make sense at all. It was a JSON file that was completely misstructured, didn't have even a single element into it. We sent that out, we provision it, and the customer never even, we had to go back and say, hey, by the way, that SBOM, oh, okay, that's fine. Just give me the new one, right? So in that case, there's a lot of significant adoption or maturity that we need to adopt in that element. For VEX, is completely different, right? For VEX, what you have had in the past is either an entity will come to you and say, hey, I ran this scanner and I have all these vulnerabilities, and then tell me the status of it. And then a human actually will go and answer those things, whether it's the tag or the guy in PSIRT or somebody in engineering. And it's a significant thing. And then we were asking the same question to engineering 2 or 3 times. And that thing, was, again, this is way back in the day, it was not truly collected anywhere, right? Now what we do is we drive all the vulnerabilities that we have, knowledge, all the CVEs, and we start doing, we call it disposition requests to engineering, which engineering hate us. So we are developing also tools to accelerate that assessment. And then that will keep in a central database and a central tool. Publicly, it's called the Cisco Vulnerability Repository. We didn't have a fancy name for it, but
sometimes clarity is king.
Yes.
Yeah. And then in that case, if a customer is actually asking about the status of one CVE, they can put that CVE in there. Or if it's tell me all the CVEs that you may know or are still investigating into a product, they can also do that. So for that, we definitely have seen a lot more adoption. Right? A lot of customers that will come through the spreadsheet that now have a tool that, and by the way, we open source that tool. The Open Vuln API also has a client that is all open source. And as long as you have Cisco.com account, which basically a guest, because you have to actually have at least an account to authenticate to an API. So that's public. All the advisories, all the CVR is all completely public. You don't need an account.
So I have a related question. I'm swinging back over off of the CVE vine into the AI vine, but how does this work with AI in the mix? How do organizations track vulnerabilities as they relate to various AI products?
Yeah. As you can imagine, we have tons of internal AI projects that definitely go beyond the chatbot.
Yeah.
Year 2022, 2023, and 2024 was mostly the year of assistance. You had, can I accelerate the way that I assess a vulnerability, right? But in that case was kind of a co-pilot of tell me everything that I can probably get from an FAQ or I can probably get from a CVE information, but, digest it better. I mean, I should not diminish assistance because they do help in many cases.
But it was kind of a let me Google that for you sort of
That's exactly right.
chatbot. Yeah.
That is exactly right. It is the very eloquent sixth grader type scenario, but again, back in those years. Now we're really starting to see the advent of reasoning. I'm not gonna throw people under the bus, but we know what the foundation model providers actually are now calling reasoning is not full reasoning, right? There's steps time compute, where you actually give inference. It's gonna go to iterations of going back and forth in the prompts. It's basically creating your own prompt, and it's a chain of thought, if you will, that then it will give you a better answer. But it's extremely powerful. That was the change that definitely we needed to go beyond getting a whole bunch of data and pretty big data centers, etc. Task time compute is still in the data centers, but that's a significant step towards more of an automatic workflow, what people call agents. So having said that, as you can imagine, we have tons of internal AI projects that definitely extend beyond the chatbot that is mostly around agentic implementation. So that includes creating agents to find vulnerabilities and accelerating the work for disposition requests, potentially creating attacks. We have a lot of projects, of course, that I cannot mention because they're internally to Cisco. I'll just leave it like that. If the bad guys are actually definitely using AI to launch attacks, we're definitely going to use AI to launch attacks against Cisco to demonstrate that, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, do you see a day where we start seeing CVEs like, here's a prompt engineering attack that's successful against these models, or is that just too much to keep track of? Or are we just going to stick with CVEs as like, this is a buffer overflow, or this is a remote code execution vulnerability in this chunk of software?
I think that you're going to see vulnerabilities in the form of CVEs that are specifically architectural flaws of a model, not like I was able to manipulate the model with prompt engineering and a specific tool, because the prompt engineering, pretty much every single model in the whole world, and it's probably going to continue like that, will have some type of deficiency that can be taken advantage because of a prompt.
Yeah.
And the problem with this, and I love this topic, we have to solve this in the industry, and I don't know how to. But the problem with this is all these models are non-deterministic. So if I give the same prompt in many cases, I may not get the same result at all. So whenever it comes to reproducing a vulnerability, let's say a cross-site scripting vulnerability, a SQL injection, pretty prescriptive. I can say, click here, click there, put this payload, boom, you reproduce it. Whenever it comes to manipulating a model, especially through prompt injection, confused deputy, etc., it may be that you will never be able to reproduce it, only just once or twice.
Okay.
So that's a big challenge in the industry. The other element, even outside of CVEs, is how you do remediation. We're getting a little bit better on that, but pruning weights on a model is not going to be, as easy as say, hey, I'm going to remediate this vulnerability like patching a SQL injection, right?
Because if I prune for one thing, I might affect other things. Is that the issue?
Indeed, absolutely.
Okay.
Your remediation probably will introduce a lot more significant problem. What you do is you work around the models, and again, a lot of proprietary stuff that foundation model companies are doing and other elements. Then going back to your question about CVEs for AI-related vulnerabilities, we're starting to see these in traditional software like LangChain, Llama Index. Nothing is immune to vulnerabilities. So you're starting to see components that are related to AI, but it's still software, even though AI models are software. But those type of vulnerabilities will hopefully continue to be disclosed in form of CVEs. The things that I strongly recommend everybody in the industry is not to make CVEs with AI incidents. Like, for example, if for some reason an AI implementation cause an automated system, I don't know, like a financial system to either buy more stock or less sell stocks, we manipulate it like that.
Yeah.
That's an incident, not a vulnerability per se. And then in the past couple of years, a lot of people actually say, no, you have to disclose these type of things in a CVE, right? So that's not a true sense of a vulnerability. So there are AI incidents databases that now are being instantiated.
Oh, okay.
So I think that has their own place, rather than actually saying, hey, this is a flaw of a model.
Got it. So you want to keep CVEs kind of like cleanly defined as opposed to letting incidents get sort of shoved in there, because there's an existing reporting model, you don't want that to be hijacked by let's report AI incidents in the CVE system.
That's absolutely right. And if later we have a standard way to then assign an identifier, we have CVEs for vulnerabilities, we have CWEs for weaknesses, we have many different identifiers, then we can decide, hey, there's a need for a common identifier to classify a given incident. One of the main purposes of CVEs is for you to cross-reference around the infrastructure for something that you need to do to remediate, to patch, and so on. In an incident that actually happened only into one system, and then there was a remediated, and so on, there's truly no need, in my opinion, for assigning a CVE for that.
Yeah, I'm with you there. What's the benefit of that? Well, you guys, I mean, you plural Cisco, imagine are doing AI and all of the things and products. And because you have such a depth and breadth of portfolio, you guys have a lot of data. So what's the process for handling that volume of data? And as far as you're allowed to share, what are you guys doing with that? What's the purpose of that?
Yeah. And this is all public. And one of the reasons that either we have made the acquisitions, et cetera, but the diversity of the data is definitely a goldmine for AI projects. So we have internal tools and algorithms that automate some of the dirty work, if I can call it that way, right? Labeling, classification, testing of the data, and so on.
The grunt work.
These things, are continuously refined, right? I mean, there's no perfect algorithm out there. Or refined through feedback loops, collaboration between data scientists, actually experts in the subject matter, whether it's a cybersecurity implementation or collaboration, etc. The main thing is that your pipelines need to be designed to normalize and standardize these different data types. But for non-generative AI elements, I mean, we even have acquired companies like, there was one in the Czech Republic that had amazing people that we embedded into many different groups. It's called Cognitive Security. And for that, of course, all that type of data pipeline, best practice, normalization, standardization of tools, algorithmic labeling of elements, we started capitalizing with some of those groups. Again, not because of generative AI. This is not new.
Right. So you do recognize, obviously, that one of the issues a company like Cisco might have is that because you've got so much data and so many different types of data, there's got to be some kind of organizational process to normalize, to get the classification, the labeling right, so that you can actually take advantage of it. And it sounds like a huge data science project.
It is. It is many, many data science projects. And in some cases, you have probably even 2 or 3 going at the same time without even realizing it, right? It's a big organization. Every single company the size of Cisco will go through the same process.
Given the richness and variety of data that you have, what do you anticipate as being like potential outcomes? Like how much benefit do you think Cisco or, the industry will see from having all of that data? And what will it mean for, security operators?
Yeah, for security operations, this is actually how we're gonna fuel. People call it the SOC of the future. Is the SOC that we needed yesterday, right? Because the dynamic of attacks, and even though if we're not seeing a significant ramp up of AI usage for attacks other than the misinformation and social engineering, etc., I can guarantee you that right now, as we speak, just like a software developer is using AI to create a web application, a lot of attackers are using AI to accelerate exploits.
Sure.
So we really need to move at machine speed, even though that's a buzzword. We really, really, really need it. The way that we had traditional security operations centers operating, even the last 2-3 years, it has to significantly be augmented with better data, better analytics, automation that, yes, in some cases is probably going to be disruptive. You're probably going to break a couple of things in there. But we have to really think about what is going to be the future of defense. And it's not going to be a human just reading logs and so on. And again, predictive analytics and everything has resisted for quite some time. But what else can I do? Can I look at this massive amount of data from cases, from threat intelligence and so on, and then have some type of actionable things that an engineer or a business leader can actually take action on it?
I was curious because you mentioned that acquisition of that Czech Republic company, and I just did a quick Google and see that acquisition was actually from 2013.
On time ago.
So this isn't new. You guys have been thinking about this and planning this strategy for a long time.
And that was not the first acquisition. It's just that I'm old and now that's the only one that I remember.
They all blur together after a while, don't they?
Yeah. But cognitive security was in the early 2010s, 2013, I think you mentioned. Those were integrated mostly with core security products, but we took some of the expertise and applied it to other places at Cisco, including networking and so on. But if you look at recently, we acquired a company a couple of years ago called Armorblocks, which was AI. Robust Intelligence is the one that we finished late last year, and now we have a product around that called AI Defense. We have partnered with Scale AI, talking about labeling and everything. That's definitely one of the leaders, if not the leader, whenever it comes to data labeling techniques in the industry. The foundation models, they use that company, just to put into perspective. So yeah, it's definitely a significant now investment in the AI realm. And we just acquired a company called Deeper Insights. And it was mostly, they had a small product, but we're not going to use the product. It's actually to embed it within our services organization. We invested in Mistral, open weight model. We gave $1 billion last year into to some of these efforts. What else? Cohere we invested on. So that's this proper, I will say, Cisco elements, but we also have Cisco investments, which is kind of like our own VC. And if you look at that, man, I'm very sure that I'm skipping at least 20 companies. Probably yesterday we just gave money to, right?
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of our acquisitions start like that, right? Strategic investments, and see if we can partner with those companies to integrate with products or even services. It doesn't have to be a product.
I understand like there's a lot of potential here for AI to help us move at machine speed, but I'm going back to the Salt Typhoon example where attacker took advantage of vulnerabilities that were around since 2017, 2018. And the reason they weren't patched wasn't because it was unknown. It was probably because we don't want to touch these systems because things are so brittle that if we patch something and it breaks, we lose millions of dollars. How do we overcome that problem?
Yeah, that's the number one thing. Is so close to my heart. Right now, not at Cisco, but out in the industry, we started a project called Open EOX, the open end of everything. And the reason for that is because even if we have AI, and I was talking about all this cool stuff that we can do nowadays, there's no single standard, no single way to determine that something is end of life and a support at all.
Mhm.
Whether it's an open source project or an AI model, or actually an AI is even worse. I'll get to that in a second. Or a core route of the internet, or product X from vendor, etc. And so we're trying to standardize that. At least tell me if something is end of support. If I have to replace it, what is my migration path? Locally now we have a lot of companies, including Microsoft and the government entities that I mentioned to you. CISA is actually the co-chair also of that effort with me, and BSI is also engaged. I mean, there's a big push also from the security vendors like the scanners of the world. Qualys is a pretty big contributor as well, onto how we are going to even determine if something is actually running that is end of life. What is my strategy to identify risk? And so on. So first, not even the tools can actually, be really some preparatory tools. Of course, Cisco has their own management tools, etc. But across the industry, there's no single way that you can determine that. So if we address that problem first and then give you the visibility, then we move to the next step. What is the next step? Exactly what you mentioned is the ease of upgrading or the ease of migration. In many cases, if it is a big infrastructure device that costs a couple $1 million, there's a thing about upgrading, but there's also a thing that, hey, I want to actually maximize my investment and I'm going to let it run because it just passed traffic through it.
Yep.
Don't touch it, right?
Yep.
And that's the type of mentality. I think that most mature companies are, of course, they realize that, but in many organizations, they don't. The other challenge that we are facing outside of what you mentioned in that attack, but many investigations that I get rolled into is devices that should have never been in a place that they were deployed. For example, we had this company that we acquired called Linksys, and then from there were a few vendors that we continue to publish or to sell different products that are related to small business or even home office type scenario. Some of those products that are end of life, end of support, like the RV series routers, have been deployed in very critical elements in different places that, again, I'm not going to go into, but it has affected critical infrastructure, it has affected hospitals, it has affected many other things because of those devices. And why is that? Because the local, let's say a managed service provider that is local, they're going to what is the cheapest, but they can run packets.
Yeah.
And has a Cisco logo, so it sounds expensive.
Yep.
And then you put your own things and they deploy it, and even though they're quote unquote managing, they're managing the endpoints, not the infrastructure devices. Right? So, and they've been there for 12, 15 years. And then whenever you're investigating some of these and you go to actually the victims, it's not like those customers even called Cisco, right? It's an investigation, in some cases with law enforcement. They show up and say, hey, we need to see how these devices actually are running packets, and they don't even know what is a router. In that case, it's just a blinky light that somebody else deployed that is in there, and now it's in a small water treatment plant and so on.
Yeah. It's a serious problem.
So what are the things that we're trying to do? One, of course, creating better visibility. The second one is from a product perspective, that's a huge push at Cisco nowadays. And I think that pretty much all the vendors is the ease of upgrading. The other thing is the ease of licensing structures and everything. That has been really complicated in the past. We have to fix that, right?
Right.
The other one, talking about ease upgrading, this is a very promising technology. We call it HyperShield at Cisco. We acquired a company called Isovalent. They have eBPF.
Yep.
We integrated some of that into the, again, I'm not a product guy, so as a matter of fact, what I do for a living is line stop products, not selling. But the technology behind it is amazing because you can run two versions of the same code at the same time and be using with not generative AI models, but some specific models to actually determine, hey, has something broken into the data path, right? Because now we actually have the ability to actually run two data planes in the same device. And then in that case, the customers are a lot easier to press that button and they say, oh yeah, I'm just going to migrate to this other version and then migrate that. And at least from upgrading, not a 15-year-old version of code, but at least upgrading, there's technology now that we're creating. And that technology is now being integrated to switches. Of course, the security play is the number one, but it's called HyperShield.
To wrap, and first, thank you for being here. This has been a really great discussion, and we appreciate you pulling the curtain back a little bit on sort of the internal workings of a large organization. But at a higher level, do you feel like the problems in enterprise security have changed in a significant way, or are we just sort of dealing with the same issues we've always been? It's just greater velocity and volume.
We definitely continue to see the same problems recurring from time to time, and that time to time is pretty often, unfortunately. At a very, very, very fast pace.
Yeah.
But we also seen new, better coordinated, type of attacks. And I'm not talking about just, the products and everything. It's against the company, the organization, and so on.
Yeah, it seems like there's more organization among criminal actors or state actors to make themselves more effective.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, I think it was on Friday that the FBI was actually putting a PSA out there on where nation states are now hiring criminals more obvious. They have done that for many, many years, but now you actually can see those tactics and techniques that are obvious that actually they're not doing this in isolation, but there are criminal organizations that are at scale coordinating it.
With governments, yeah.
Now, as far as the defenses, that's some of the things that we have before the whole AI, generative AI bandwagon. We try to do even inside of Cisco. So even, I'll give you an example. The Security Operations Center within CSIRT, they have operated and tried to automate a lot of the playbooks that they have. And the SOC analysts sit with Jupyter notebooks. Before there was Cool and ChatGPT was in there, they had, dozens and dozens of plays that were mostly automated. Now, of course, we acquired Splunk, and there's a lot of other additional efforts in there. But yeah, the way that we need to prepare ourselves for that wave that is definitely coming, the better orchestration, the scale of exploits being available for those individuals and organizations, bad guys, to do malfeasance. Definitely, we have to rethink our strategies.
Yeah.
And especially how they're also using these emerging technologies for manipulating individuals for extortion.
Yeah.
It's a significant scale, a different scale nowadays.
Yeah. All right. Well, that does bring us to the end of our time with you, Omar. If folks want to find you online, what's a good way to see what you're up to or to connect?
I think that whether it's LinkedIn, X, or Twitter, I'm pretty available. If you're interested in any of the things that we've mentioned here today, like the end of EOX, so Open EOX efforts, we're creating the standard there, whether it's the Coalition for Secure AI. This is actually open to every single person in the industry. Even though you see a whole bunch of logos in the website, these are industry efforts. We need less logos and more people that are in the trenches. And I mean that, right? I mean, the main thing, especially whenever it comes to securing these AI implementations, are the people that are going to implement this within their environments, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Not the foundation models or the Ciscos of the world and so on.
Okay, that's openeox.org, and we'll also have that in the links that accompany this podcast, along with Omar's LinkedIn, if you want to go say hello there. That does wrap up the show. Thank you, Omar, for being with us and sharing your information. And thanks to you for joining us for another episode of Packet Protector. If you have a topic you want us to cover, or a comment or a correction or a question, you can reach out at packetpushers.net/FU. We do love when listeners reach out and we do follow up. By the way, Packet Protector is part of the Packet Pushers podcast network, and that network includes a dozen technical podcasts for your professional development on networking, security, IPv6, DevOps, and more. We also have an industry blog, 2 weekly newsletters, a community Slack group, a YouTube channel, even an IRC group. You can find it all at packetpushers.net. It's all free, no login required. As always, remember to do those security push-ups.